Hello and welcome to another episode in the Essential DOS Games series. Today we're looking at a genre that really thrived on PCs in the 90s, driving games. I'm calling this driving games rather than racing because although the majority of them are racing games, some of them don't actually involve racing in the traditional sense. So without further ado, let's have a look at 15 must-play DOS driving games. Let's start off with a game that I played to death back in the day, no pun intended, Carmageddon. It was developed by Stainless Games and published by SCI in 1997, although Interplay published the game in North America. As with a couple of other games on this list, it garnered some controversy at the time of release due to its violence. Like most controversial 90s games, the violence is comically tame to us now, but the running over of pedestrians was the aspect that caused the most uproar, probably among those sporting "can I speak to your manager" hairdos. However, this controversy was what they were actually aiming for. See, Carmageddon started off as a sort of Demolition Derby game, but Psygnosis released Demolition Derby, so Stainless decided to add pedestrians that could be run over and killed. The thing was, that had been done before, for example in one game that you'll see later on this list from 1994. I think that at one point they wanted to use the Mad Max license for this game, but for whatever reason that fell through. So they decided to kick it up a notch by awarding the player points for killing them. That should cause some uproar. And it did just that. Sadly, this led to some censorship. Here in the UK they had to change the pedestrians to zombies and change the blood to green goo, although eventually the classification board relented and the original version was allowed onto shelves here. Gameplay wise, you have a lot of freedom in Carmageddon. There are multiple events in which you can take part, for example races, destroying all the opponent's cars or killing all the pedestrians in a level. The latter was great fun for a teenage boy, and many hours were spent trying to do ridiculous drifts and flips into crowds of pedestrians to get some particularly stylish kills. Kill combos can award you more points, and you get some hilarious bonuses displayed on screen, like bonus for artistic impression. This was an absolute blast back when I was 16, and it's still great fun to play. Another plus was the inclusion of several tracks from Fear Factory's Demanufacture album, which I haven't listened to for ages but loved as a 16-year-old. A lot of them are just instrumental versions, so they actually work very well with the gameplay. Although considered graphic at the time, Carmageddon is just laughably tame by today's standards, but worth a look if you like driving games that stray from the usual racing format. "4D Sports Driving" is another game I played for days, no weeks on end back in the day. In fact, most of these games are, so it's a bit of a moot point. You may know this game as Stunts, which was its title in North America, but over here it was renamed to fit under the umbrella of the 4D Sports series of games. Developed by Distinctive Software, it was published as Stunts by Broderbund in 1990 and by Mindscape in Europe as 4D Sports Driving in 91. This is an odd one as the whole appeal of the game is designing tracks. I'd spend countless hours in the track editor building ridiculous tracks with loops, corkscrews and huge jumps, and then play around with them by driving the tracks I'd made. There was a strange appeal to designing absurdly large jumps and placing a barn underneath, or building a huge run up to a series of loop-de-loops. You'd get a set play area in which to build your course, like a top-down map, then you place tiles for the different track elements, pretty straightforward stuff. So once you actually play your tracks, you can do a time trial or race against opponents, but sadly there wasn't a local multiplayer option. The graphics are no frills polygons, including the cars which look very blocky, but believe it or not this was actually pretty damn cool looking to 10-year-old me. There are 11 cars to drive and the game has some quite good features for a 1990 driving game, like options for manual and automatic, different road surfaces and its physics engine for the handling. Another superb feature was the replay function, which let you play back your escapades and also play around with the camera angles. That was a lot of fun to mess about with too. I'm very fond of 4D Sports Driving, so it just had to make this list. The Micro Machines series from Codemasters graced many consoles and computers, with Micro Machines 2 being my favourite. Although I mostly played the Mega Drive version, which came out in '94, a decent DOS port came out the following year, although not until 1996 in North America. I'm sure most of you have played a Micro Machines game at some point. If you haven't, I'd definitely recommend giving this a try with some friends because it's one of the most fun competitive local multiplayer games ever made. Based on the toys of the same name, it involves racing these tiny vehicles around tracks set in everyday household locations like tables, countertops, pool tables, baths, etc. It's very simple and there's not much more to it than that, but it's this simplicity that makes it so much fun. As I said, it's best played with friends and everyone will have a chance to win as it's easy to pick up and play and anything can happen. This is mainly due to the points system, which breaks up the races into mini races whereby points are awarded by gaining enough of a lead on your opponents rather than just being a straight up race to the finish line. An absolute classic of the genre for sure. Screamer is an arcade racer released in 1995 as a DOS exclusive. Developed by Graffiti and published by Virgin, this was the PC's answer to Ridge Racer. I mean, this looks ridiculously good for a 95 DOS game, doesn't it? This looks like it could actually be an arcade game. Super fast, very smooth and absolutely gorgeous graphics. This was achieved using software rendering, as in the software did the hard work rather than relying on hardware, because 3D graphics cards simply weren't about at the time. This had a downside though, as it made Screamer very processor intensive, so you'd need to be upping your hardware if you were still running a 486. This is right up my street, it's about as arcade racers can get. The computer controlled cars have AI that's a bit weak, but there's a good selection of cars and gameplay modes. And the music's great too. It's a metal soundtrack composed by Alistair Brimble, who's done an absolutely absurd number of soundtracks over the years. My favourites of his are probably Miami Chase on the Amiga, The Lost Vikings, Mortal Kombat, Cannon Fodder, Descent, the list goes on. Screamer was criticised for being a bit shallow, but how much substance does an arcade racer really need? Ridge Racer was hugely successful and there's not much to that either. If Screamer is proof of anything, it's that sometimes simplicity just works. Hi-Octane is a combat racing game that came to DOS first in 1995, although we didn't get this in Europe until 96. This was developed by Bullfrog and, as with most of their games, was published by EA. This gets some stick because it came out at a similar time to Wipeout and is clearly inferior, but it's still a very well made futuristic racer. This is quite impressive considering it was essentially knocked up on the side. Some Bullfrog employees started this project in their spare time using the Magic Carpet engine. It ended up being developed to completion in 2 months and was released. The use of the Magic Carpet engine brought both advantages and disadvantages to Hi-Octane. The pace is excellent and it's very smooth with great handling, but the draw distance is shockingly short. There are 6 ships and 6 tracks. The ships have varying levels of armour, speed and weapon power, etc. In contrast to Wipeout, where you have to pick up weaponry, Hi-Octane ships have an onboard minigun which has limited ammo and can be upgraded by collecting the relevant power-ups. Other collectible power-ups include ammo refills, boost upgrades and pickups that replenish your fuel and shield. If you're a fan of the futuristic racing games like Wipeout and F-Zero, then this is worth a look, as despite its shortcomings it has a superb sense of speed. One of the 2 most primitive games on this list, Street Rod, came out in 1989, co-developed by PZ Karen Code Development Group and Logical Design Works, and published by California Dreams. Set in the 60s, this features some really cool old school cars straight out of an episode of Happy Days, hot rods as the name suggests, and old American muscle cars. You start off by buying a cheap car from the classifieds, and you can use your garage to make improvements to your car. You can buy upgrades and tweak the engine to up its performance. Once you've fiddled with your car, you can head to the local diner, where else, to find other car owners to race. You can then take them on and decide what you want to bet on the race. This might be just for fun, for a few dollars, all the way up to the pink slips for the cars. So if you win, you get the other guy's car to take back to your garage and add to your collection. Nice. Winning cash also helps you along, of course, allowing you to buy additional parts and better cars. This is very 80s DOS, so very basic in its presentation, especially with regards to the sound, but the graphics do have that 80s DOS-like quality to them which I really appreciate. There's nothing quite like this on the list, or at all for that matter as I'm aware, so Street Rod is a clever and unique DOS experience. Quarantine is a game that I absolutely adored back in the day. First of all, let's take a second to appreciate that minimalist box art. Windscreen wipers wiping away a thick pool of blood. It tells you everything you need to know in a way. This was developed by ImageXL, is it ImageXL or ImageXL, I was never sure, and published by GameTech in 1994. It initially came to DOS and the 3DO, but did appear on PlayStation and Saturn later under different names. ImageXL, or however you pronounce it, only developed 3 games under that moniker, one being Technocop, which I had on the Amiga. They are now Rockstar Toronto. The game takes place in the not too distant future, after a corporation tests a chemical intended to pacify the city's residents by introducing it to the water supply. The test backfires spectacularly, turning many of the population into insane murderers. Your character Drake must escape the city. To do so, he has to pick up fares in his hover taxi or deliver packages and make enough money to sufficiently upgrade his cab. So basically an insanely violent crazy taxi, except this has missions too. Your taxi is equipped with weaponry which can of course be upgraded over time. There's a map you can use to plot the most efficient routes to take, which is essential for a taxi driver looking to maximise his income, and new areas of the map unlock after you've completed a certain amount of the story missions. So basically you drive around doing missions and errands, blasting these mental city dwellers away with your built-in weapons, or in style by performing drive-bys with an Uzi. It actually plays more like a Doom clone than a driving game, similar to how Descent feels if you've ever played that. You're in a car, sure, but the actual interface is pretty much the same as DOS first-person shooters, and it works well. The last thing I'll mention is Quarantine's awesome soundtrack. Because the game came on CD, you could actually just pop it into your CD player to listen to the soundtrack, which I did frequently in my bedroom as a kid. It consisted mostly of Australian rock bands, but one track called The Driver Is You really sticks in my memory even to this day. The chorus repeats the line, "He just stepped from the road into your headlights," which I found hilarious and was so perfect for the game. I can't play the soundtrack for you due to copyright reasons, but the whole thing is on YouTube if you want to look it up. Quarantine was a game that nailed whimsical automotive violence way before Carmageddon and GTA, but doesn't seem to get as much love. Speaking of GTA, another game that caused a bit of uproar for its violent content was the original Grand Theft Auto. Do you know how often I hear people saying that this has aged badly, that it's no longer worth playing? Poppycock. GTA is still an enjoyable game that many modern retro-inspired games try to emulate. This was developed by the UK-based DMA Design, who famously developed Lemmings and eventually became Rockstar North. It was published by BMG Interactive on DOS and Windows in 1997. Obviously, this is highly regarded because it spawned the entire GTA series, one of the most successful franchises of all time, but it's a game that's worth playing on its own merits. It actually began life as Race and Chase, a concept for the Amiga for which DMA had experience developing games. The game takes place from a top-down viewpoint set in 3 fictional cities, Liberty City, Vice City and San Andreas. Ring any bells? Yes, these are the 3 cities that were brought to life in 3D in GTA 3, Vice City and San Andreas. They were based on New York, Miami and San Francisco respectively. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't a true driving game, as a considerable amount of the game is played on foot, but it's always been a driving game to me. After all, it is called Grand Theft Auto. You control several characters roaming around the cities causing mischief. The main appeal of the game at the time was you were pretty much left to your own devices. You can do whatever you want to, steal cars, drive around, rob banks, and commit various other crimes to make money. This ethos of freedom continued on in the subsequent games too. Your only aim was to make money, and hitting certain financial targets would unlock other areas of the cities. I'm not sure why people say this has aged poorly. The graphics are certainly better than the majority of 3D games that were coming out on consoles at the time, and the gameplay is structured to let you play the game in the way you would find to be the most fun. What's not to like? You might associate this one more with the PlayStation or Saturn version, but Destruction Derby also came to DOS in 1995. Yes, in the UK we say Derby, isn't it hilarious? Whatever you call it, this was developed by Reflections, and as with almost all of their 80s and 90s games, it was published by Psygnosis, who by this time had been bought by Sony. This one is a bit different, as the name indicates it's based on Demolition Derby. There are 4 events: Destruction Derby, which lets you smash the hell out of the other cars in a circular arena; Stock Car Racing, a more traditional racing format; Wrecking Racing, which is the same as stock car racing but you also smash up your opponents; and Time Trial, which is self-explanatory. This DOS version also featured an online multiplayer mode. The reason the game works so well is its vehicle destruction physics, which Reflections spent a considerable amount of time perfecting as they believed it was integral to the gameplay, and they were right. Definitely one to try if you want to break from the usual racing setup, and especially if you like some good old-fashioned destruction. Fatal Racing is another arcade racer developed and published by Gremlin in Europe in 1995 and by Interplay in North America in 1996, where it was renamed Whiplash. This has a lot in common with Screamer in that it was released around the same time, it's again a DOS exclusive and has that Ridge Racer-esque arcade feel. This does have a better selection of vehicles and the tracks are a bit spicier with some fun features like corkscrew jumps. A nice little touch is the AI opponents' names, which are based on various robots and computers from sci-fi shows, including Crichton and Slave from Red Dwarf and Blake 7 respectively, 2 UK sci-fi programmes of which I'm a huge fan. Fatal Racing is very similar to Screamer, but just different enough to warrant checking out both, and again proved that PCs could do arcade races well in the mid-90s. The other game that's very primitive is Test Drive 2 The Duel, which, as with Street Rod, was released in 1989. This was developed by Distinctive Software and published by Accolade. This involves racing either against the clock or against AI opponents on highways with various scenery. The aim is to reach the petrol station at the end of the course in the fastest time or before your rival. You have the option of driving a Porsche or Ferrari in this, the latter looking especially cool. They did release add-on discs later on which added several more vehicles, including a Lamborghini, Lotus, Mustang, Corvette and Dodge Charger among others. While you're racing you'll pass police cars, and if they catch you speeding they'll pursue you in order to give you a ticket. If you get pulled over, that costs you valuable time. This is pretty basic now but was great for the late 80s and it's still enjoyable. Ignition is a brilliantly fun racing game developed by Unique Development Studios and published by Virgin in 1996. This could actually pass as a Micro Machines game because the little vehicles in it look quite like them. In fact, several of the vehicles available just like Micro Machines toys I had as a kid, like the police car, army medical truck, sports car and monster truck. Just like the Micro Machines games, learning the twists and turns of the tracks will help you win here, but you'll also need to play dirty by ramming your opponents off the track into water or off of cliffs. The camera works differently in Ignition though. Although you're playing from a top-down viewpoint, your camera is fixed on the vehicle. There's a decent selection of vehicles to drive, including those I mentioned earlier, and other buses, cars, trucks, etc. Each has its own unique horn or siren, giving each vehicle a bit of personality beyond just its appearance. The terrain and scenery are nicely varied too, and the tracks are quite well designed with hidden shortcuts to find. Ignition is a somewhat underloved racing game that's a lot of fun. If you're thinking what's really missing from this list is something like Mario Kart, then Wacky Wheels has got you covered. This was a DOS exclusive developed by Beavis Soft, released by Apogee in 1994. Obviously heavily influenced by the original Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo, Wacky Wheels bears more than just a passing resemblance. The gameplay, track design and characters are just like those in Mario Kart. There are 8 characters, all various cartoony animals which aren't to scale. I've never seen a raccoon-sized elephant or vice versa. There's a decent amount of customization in terms of the resolution and what's on the heads-up display. There are a few game modes including regular races and an arena battle mode, again just like Mario Kart. Either can be played solo, in 2-player split screen or via modem, and there's also a duck shooting game. As one would expect, there are collectible offensive and defensive weapons to pick up on the tracks. Hedgehogs can be fired at your opponents and work in a similar way to the shells in Mario Kart. The other items can be strategically dropped to scupper your rivals, like bombs and oil cans. You'll need to use all these collectibles effectively to succeed, as well as master the handbrake turns and utilise the speed boosts and jumps. This can easily be fobbed off as a Mario Kart clone, but considering that this is exactly what the developers were going for, I'd say it's a job well done. And there was nothing quite like this on PCs at the time. Wacky Wheels came to GOG about 5 years ago, and subsequently on Steam as well. Although I've never been the biggest fan of Formula 1 games, it would be remiss of me to omit them from a list of driving games. Grand Prix 2 from Microprose is one of the best to come to DOS. This game looks absolutely stunning, but to be fair to the other games, this was a relatively late release, having come out in 1996. Its good looks are thanks to 3D texture mapping and SVGA graphics, in addition to a physics engine that was reasonably advanced for the time. Interestingly, the physics could be played with a bit, for example turning the vehicle damage off and on. Despite its 96 release, Grand Prix 2 actually simulates the 1994 F1 season and was developed with a full license to use the real cars, teams, circuits and drivers. The graphics are even more impressive in motion, and the gameplay is super smooth, and the in-game visuals aren't the only appeal. There are some nicely detailed photographic backgrounds between races. The sound effects are bang on too. There's a ton of content here for a Grand Prix fan. The cars allowed a lot of customization, including the optional use of several driving aids, which let the player decide how much manual control they wanted over the car's handling and performance. There are several game modes too. All this sounds pretty standard stuff today, but this level of bespoke tweaking in an F1 game was a pretty big deal at the time, so Grand Prix 2 quickly made a name for itself. Super Off-Road is another one that I don't immediately associate with DOS, but had a great port nonetheless. I absolutely love this game, having played it to death on my Amiga as a kid and subsequently the arcade cabinet many times. Super Off-Road usually went by the full title Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road, and was originally an arcade game developed by Leland, released in 1989. Numerous home ports emerged in the next couple of years, including this DOS version in 1990. Another example of simplicity triumphing, Super Off-Road has a very basic setup. 4 off-road vehicles race around several tracks littered with bumps, jumps and hazards to slow you down, like puddles of water and oil patches. Apart from steering a vehicle, the only other gameplay mechanic is using your nitros. These are limited, so need to be used strategically and sparingly to win a race. You can collect extra nitros during races though, as they pop up sporadically. As does cash. These little bags of money will appear every now and again too. Both pickups increase with each appearance, so the first money bag will contain 10 grand, increasing by 10,000 each time, and the first nitro pickup will be a single nitro boost, then increasing by 1 each time. Money is also earned by placing in a race, and you can spend your cash in the shop between levels, so this can be a bit of a trade-off too. Do you spend your winnings on car upgrades like suspension, a faster engine, better acceleration or tyres, or do you simply buy a pile of extra nitros? Or perhaps a combination of both? It all gets very amusing and it's jolly good fun to play with friends, but admittedly once you all have fully upgraded vehicles it can descend into a battle of who's got the most nitros. I've been playing this one for almost 30 years now and it's still fun. So that was 15 must-play DOS driving games. Let me know in the comments if any of these interest you or what your favourite DOS driving games are. And as always, thanks for watching. You can find the other episodes in my Essential DOS Games series in this playlist.